Am I the bad guy for telling my wife the lock on my daughter's door does not get removed until my brother-in-law and his daughters are out of our house? My brother-in-law, Sammy, lost his home shortly after his divorce about 10 months ago. A couple of months ago, he moved in with us, bringing along his twin daughters, Olivia and Sloane, who are both 18. My wife, Sammy's sister, and I have a 16-year-old daughter, Zoe. While Zoe and her cousins aren't particularly close, they've always managed to get along, at least on the surface. But things quickly got complicated. Olivia and Sloane had absolutely no respect for Zoe's privacy. They would waltz into her room without asking, and help themselves to anything they wanted. Makeup, clothes, phone accessories, even her school laptop. Zoe complained constantly, and I could see how much it was upsetting her. I had several conversations with the twins, asking them to respect Zoe's space, but it didn't seem to make a difference. Unfortunately, my wife and Sammy didn't see the problem. They brushed it off as typical teenage behavior, insisting that girls will be girls. The breaking point came when Zoe bought herself a $60 MAC makeup kit. She'd been saving for over a month to afford it, and she was so excited to finally have it. But one day, she found it ruined. Shades mixed together and smeared beyond use. It didn't take long to figure out that Sloane was responsible. When Zoe discovered her damaged makeup on her bed, she burst into tears, devastated. She told me how hard she'd worked to save for it, and how it felt like nothing in her room was safe anymore. I went to my wife and told her what had happened. She said she'd ask Sloane to apologize, but that didn't feel like enough. I decided to take matters into my own hands and bought Zoe a lock for her bedroom door. When I installed it, Zoe looked so relieved. Finally, she had some control over her space. Sammy and his daughters, on the other hand, were furious. Sammy confronted me, saying that his daughters weren't thieves and that it was perfectly normal for girls to borrow things from each other. He dismissed Zoe's makeup kit as overpriced and unnecessary, even suggesting that she was too young for adult makeup anyway. He claimed I was coddling her and blamed me for enabling her behavior. My wife wasn't any happier. She said the lock made it seem like Zoe was isolating herself from her cousins and accused me of treating them unfairly. She argued that I should consider Olivia and Sloane as my own daughters and insisted I remove the lock to avoid upsetting them further. I refused. I told her the lock wasn't going anywhere until her brother and his daughters moved out. That didn't go over well. She accused me of being heartless and implied that her family would never forgive me for this. That's when I reminded her of something crucial. Sammy and his daughters were living with us because her family, the very people who were supposedly going to hate me for setting boundaries, had refused to take them in. I told her that if her family had stepped up, we wouldn't be in this situation at all. Now the house is thick with tension. Sammy and his daughters are giving both Zoe and me the silent treatment, and my wife is still upset. But as far as I'm concerned, protecting Zoe's privacy and peace of mind is non-negotiable.
Am I the bad guy for pretending to get fired when customers get a temper with me? I'm a high schooler with a weekend job at a coffee shop. The work itself is fine, but the best part is my coworkers. On weekends, it's usually just me, James, and Danielle. James is the owner's son and goes to my school. He's technically the shift manager, but it's not super formal. He's more of a laid-back, friendly guy than a bossy manager. Then there's Danielle, a college student who works weekends sometimes. She's really chill and easy to get along with, so our team vibe is usually pretty good. But working customer service has its downsides, and one of the worst parts is dealing with those customers. You know the type. The ones who walk in already angry and ready to take it out on whoever's unlucky enough to serve them. Sometimes it's over something small, like their coffee not being hot enough or the wrong amount of foam on their latte. Other times they're just mad at life in general, and we're their convenient targets. It's wild to me how grown adults can blow up at high school and college kids over the smallest things. So one day, James and I were joking about how ridiculous some of these people are, and how satisfying it would be to mess with them a little. Maybe teach them a lesson about how their behavior affects others. Fast forward to a particularly chaotic Saturday. A guy came in and ordered coffee, and almost immediately he started fuming because it wasn't hot enough. I explained that I had just poured it straight from the machine, but he wasn't having it. He started ranting about how terrible the service was, how we clearly didn't know what we were doing, and so on. That's when James stepped in. He walked over, looking all serious, and said, "Sir, is there a problem here?" The guy turned his anger on James, ranting even more about how his coffee wasn't good enough. James didn't miss a beat. He turned to me and said, "OP, this is unacceptable. You're fired." I played along, putting on my best devastated employee act. "No, please don't fire me," I begged. "My family needs the money. I really need this job. Please, I'm so sorry." James stayed in character, crossing his arms and shaking his head. "Take off your apron and leave," he said sternly. At that point, the angry guy started to backtrack. "Wait, it's not that big of a deal," he said, looking a little panicked. "You don't need to fire her over it. I didn't mean it like that." But James kept going, saying, "We pride ourselves on the best customer service, and this is unacceptable." The guy ended up apologizing, saying he'd overreacted and didn't want to get anyone fired. After he left, we burst out laughing in the back room. Of course, I wasn't actually fired. It was all just an act. After that, we started using the firing routine whenever a customer got unnecessarily angry at me or Danielle. James would storm in, pretend to fire one of us, and most of the time, the customer would immediately feel guilty and apologize. It was weirdly satisfying to watch them realize their actions had consequences, even if only for a moment. But here's the thing. When I told my friends from school about it, the reactions were mixed. Some of them thought it was hilarious and genius, but others said it was kind of mean. They pointed out that the customers might leave genuinely thinking they got someone fired, especially if they believed that person desperately needed the money. Now I'm wondering if we went too far or if it's just harmless fun.
Am I wrong for bringing up my brother's premature birth at Christmas dinner to get my parents to shut up? I'm a nurse practitioner, and part of my job is being the primary care provider for many low-risk maternity cases at the practice where I work. I collaborate closely with doctors and midwives to ensure healthy maternity, birth, and postpartum experiences for patients. I'm proud of what I do, and I've learned a lot about family dynamics, pregnancy, and relationships through my work. At home, I live with my fiancé, who's completing her medical residency. We've been together for several years, and we're in no rush to tie the knot. We originally planned to get married a couple of years ago, but life got busy. Residency and our demanding careers don't leave a lot of room for wedding planning. That said, we're finally set to get married in June. Unfortunately, my very religious parents are not thrilled about our current arrangement. The fact that their youngest son is living in sin has been a sore spot for years. I'm used to their comments at this point, and honestly, I don't care much anymore. I'm an adult, and I live my life the way I choose. Still, it drives them crazy, especially because my older siblings either waited until marriage to live with their partners or got married quickly after moving in together. This Christmas, we visited my parents' house where everyone in the family was gathered. My parents, my 3 siblings, their spouses, 7 grandchildren, my fiancé, and me. A total of 17 people. Things were going well until dinner, when my mom decided it was the perfect time to bring up my living in sin situation. She started talking about how relieved she was that we were finally getting married so she wouldn't have to feel embarrassed at church anymore. Then my dad chimed in, saying how proud he was of my siblings for doing things the right way. My fiancé was visibly uncomfortable, and I was furious. This was an old argument we'd had too many times before, and dragging it out at a family dinner was crossing a line. I've asked my parents repeatedly to accept that they can't control how I live my life. In fact, I don't even stay at their house when I visit. I book a hotel because it's easier and avoids these conflicts. But apparently, that wasn't enough to keep the peace this time. So, I decided to shut it down once and for all. I casually brought up a story about a premature baby I'd been reading about. A tiny, resilient little thing born almost 3 months early, weighing just 1.6 pounds. The NICU staff had high hopes for the baby's survival, and I shared how incredible it was. As I spoke, I noticed my parents exchanging nervous glances. They were starting to realize where this was headed. I turned to my dad and asked, "Hey, didn't you say my oldest brother was born almost 4 months premature? Do you think we could check the family album with the birth records later?" Here's the thing, I already knew the truth. My brother was over 9 pounds and nearly 23 inches long when he was born. My grandmother spilled the beans years ago when my parents first tried to shame me about my relationship. The topic changed very quickly after that. Later, after dinner, my parents pulled me aside to tell me I shouldn't bring up private family matters to embarrass them. I told them that if I ever heard another comment about my living arrangements, I would happily remind everyone that my mom was well into her second trimester when they got married. They didn't take it well. My mom said I was out of line for telling them how to behave in their own home. But you know what? My fiancé is thrilled that the subject seems to be off the table for good. And honestly, so am I.
Am I wrong for walking out of the airport when I saw my husband's mom standing there with her luggage? I don't even know where to begin. It's been a nightmare lately, and I feel like I've been losing my grip on reality. To give some context, my husband's relationship with his mom has always been complicated, to say the least. She blatantly favors him over his siblings, and while he doesn't seem to see a problem with it, it's had a significant impact on everyone around him, including me. This dynamic has always made me uncomfortable, but my husband brushes it off as normal. For him, going low contact with her is not even an option. He has to call or see her every single day. His siblings, unsurprisingly, don't have much to do with him. I firmly believe that their strained relationships are due to their mom's favoritism. And while I know she's a big part of the problem, my husband bears some responsibility for refusing to acknowledge the damage this has caused. Over time, I found myself constantly making excuses for his behavior, both to others and to myself. I didn't even realize I was doing it most of the time. I guess it's because I love him so much and wanted to believe we could work through this without letting it ruin our marriage. But then came the breaking point: the trip. When I tried to talk to him about how I felt, his response was full of blame, directed entirely at me. He didn't take any responsibility for his actions or his role in the situation. I told him I needed space and that I was going to stay with my sister for a while. His reaction? He stood up, opened the door, and told me to leave right then and there. That moment was a turning point for me. Seeing how unwilling he was to understand my feelings or acknowledge my pain made everything crystal clear. I couldn't imagine spending years, decades, living like this, with him always needing to be right and his mother always being beyond reproach. I was always the aggressor, the jealous one, the crazy one. Never them. Hearing others' advice and concerns was the wake-up call I desperately needed. As much as I wish it hadn't come to this, I can't change what's already happened. Now I'm staying with my sister, and I brought my dog along for comfort. My husband sent me one last message, accusing me of choosing to end our relationship. But in my heart, I know it's not true. He made that choice the moment he prioritized his mother over our marriage time and time again. I'm not angry with him. I don't even expect him to change. But I've realized I deserve the chance to decide what's best for me and my future, even if that means separation or divorce. I'm heartbroken, exhausted, and overwhelmed. But for the first time in a long time, I feel like I can breathe again.
Am I wrong for refusing to stop cooking bacon in my kitchen due to my teenage daughter's vegan lifestyle? Dad here, self-proclaimed old fart, and I absolutely adore my daughter. But lately, I'm struggling to see eye to eye with her and my wife on a particular issue. We've always been a meat-eating family. Living in the rural Midwest, bacon for breakfast is almost a tradition. But this year, my 14-year-old daughter decided to go vegan. I was totally on board with supporting her. We learned to substitute ingredients, cooked new recipes together, and even adjusted the grocery budget to accommodate the more expensive vegan options she needed. Everything was going smoothly until recently. One morning, she caught me cooking bacon in a pan. Afterward, I rinsed the pan out and loaded it into the dishwasher, as I usually do. She got really upset, saying that the pan I used was her vegan-only pan. I was completely caught off guard. I told her, "Kiddo, this pan is older than you, and it's a family pan. It's not your pan." She then asked me to buy her a separate pan that she could use exclusively for vegan cooking. Wanting to support her, I said, "Sure." And I ordered her a set of brightly colored pans to help me remember they're hers and for vegan food only. But apparently, that wasn't enough. Now she's upset about the dishwasher being contaminated with animal products. She says the fridge has bacon grease fingers on it because I eat bacon and then touch it. For the record, I do wash my hands, but even the idea of it bothers her. She's asked my wife and me to completely stop cooking and eating meat in the house. I'm firmly on team hell no. Her mom, however, is more open to the idea. My wife thinks we should consider it so our daughter feels comfortable in the kitchen. She even suggested that since both our parents live nearby, we could just eat meat at their houses instead. My daughter says cheese and butter in the fridge are fine, but meat products specifically make her feel sick. I sympathize with her feelings, but I also think she needs to learn to live side by side with people who make different choices. I love and support her, but I'm not going to stop eating bacon in my own home.
Am I wrong for planting bushes in my front yard to keep the neighbors' kids from my property? I moved into a detached townhouse a few months ago. It's a rental, and I'm leasing it for a year with the option to extend for a second year, or even potentially buy the house if everything works out. It's in a nice area, with quiet streets, decent amenities, and a layout that gives me just enough space to breathe. I thought it would be the perfect place to settle for a while, until I realized I had neighbors who don't understand boundaries. My driveway is right next to the neighbors. It's big enough to fit 2 regular-sized cars and has a path halfway down that leads around my house. On one side of the path is my house, and on the other side is about 3 meters of yard space that's part of my property. The setup seemed straightforward, but I quickly learned that the neighbors either couldn't or wouldn't respect those boundaries. Ever since I moved in, I've had issues with the neighbors using my driveway for parking, turning their cars around, storing their random items, and even playing there with their kids. At first, I tried to handle it politely. I asked them to stop using my driveway and to keep their belongings on their property. Unfortunately, my requests fell on deaf ears. They either ignored me or acted like I was being unreasonable. Finally, I placed a few large plants, installed a security camera, and added a no trespassing sign. This seemed to help a little. At least the cars stopped showing up, but the issues were far from over. The latest problem involved their kids, who were about 5 and 7 years old. These boys have been making it nearly impossible for me to work from home. They ring my doorbell multiple times a day to ask if they can play with my dog, if I want to play with them, or any other excuse they can come up with. I've asked them to stop, but they haven't listened. Instead, they've escalated their behavior. When I removed the doorbell battery to get some peace, they started running around my front yard, banging on my windows and doors, and even tried to open the gate to my backyard because they heard me out there. I spoke to their parents about it, thinking they would step in. Instead, their dad shrugged it off with the classic "boys will be boys" excuse and said they weren't going to do anything about it. The mom didn't even pretend to care. This attitude infuriated me. How hard is it to teach kids basic respect for other people's property? To keep my sanity intact, I warned the boys that if they kept this up, I wouldn't let them play with my dog anymore. They seemed to understand at first, but the next day the behavior continued. Frustrated, I told their dad again to keep his kids off my property. When he refused to take me seriously, I mentioned that I might plant some prickly bushes to make the boundaries clearer. He scoffed and walked away. That's when I decided to follow through on my plan. I went to a local nursery and purchased a variety of thorny plants, including blackberries and raspberries. I planted them along the sides of my garden facing the driveway, leaving about 30 centimeters of space from the edge to ensure that no branches would overhang onto the driveway. On the inner side of the berry bushes, I planted strawberries, tomatoes, and other produce to create a little garden oasis. The idea was simple. If the kids wanted to get to the strawberries or tomatoes, they'd have to go through the thorny bushes or walk right up to my house, around the side, and into the garden. Something that clearly couldn't be done by mistake. For a couple of weeks, things quieted down. The kids still played on the driveway occasionally, but they stayed out of my garden and stopped running around my house. I thought I had finally managed to establish some boundaries. Then berry season started. The raspberries ripened, and the bushes were bursting with fruit. One afternoon, I caught the boys picking and eating raspberries from my garden. I immediately went outside, told them off, and marched them back to their house. When I spoke to their mom, I explained that the boys were stealing from my garden and warned her that if it happened again, I would call the police. She huffed and dismissed me, saying I needed to grow up and that they were just kids. Her attitude made it clear that she wasn't going to take any responsibility. I hoped my warning would be enough to keep them away, but a few days later the situation escalated. I came home from running errands to find the dad and his two sons right in the middle of my garden, stripping the bushes and plants of all their berries. They had brought bags and were filling them up as if my garden were a public park. They didn't even notice me at first. Furious, I stepped back, called the police, and started filming them while I waited for the officers to arrive. The police arrived quickly and confronted the neighbors, who were still busy picking berries. The officers explained that they were trespassing and that taking the berries was considered theft. For the first time, I saw genuine fear on the dad's face. He stammered and struggled to justify his actions, occasionally glancing back toward his house as if hoping his wife would come out and rescue him. She didn't. The officers escorted them back to their property, and I went inside to calm down. Later, the officers came to my door and asked if I wanted to press charges. I thought about it and ultimately decided not to, at least for now. I asked the officers if they thought the dad had learned his lesson. One of them smiled and said he probably had, but the mom had been yelling at both her husband and the officers, calling me a little bitch and insisting that I was overreacting. Clearly, she wasn't on the same page. To prevent further issues, I've installed an additional camera on the wall between my garden and the road to cover the entire front yard and driveway. I've made it clear to the neighbors that if I catch them or their kids on my property again, I won't hesitate to press charges. While the dad seems to have gotten the message, I'm not so sure about the mom. Time will tell if they've truly learned their lesson. But for now, I'm standing my ground and making it clear that my property is not their playground.